Award-winning innovation maverick and global pharma strategist Mike Rea of Idea Pharma with us today on Red Hot Healthcare. Let's go.
3 alarm at 21 and north. All engines respond.
This is Red Hot Healthcare. Interviews with today's leaders and all the news that matters. Here's your host, Steve Ambrose.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Steve Ambrose, and you can subscribe to our podcast by visiting redhothealthcare.com and clicking on the iTunes, Stitcher, or other podcast directory links. We're going to go off twice a week on this show. Each Tuesday, you're going to get healthcare news and my takes, and every Thursday will be at least one engaging Red Hot leader interview. Reach out with your comments or questions by emailing steve@redhothealthcare.com or hit me up on my Twitter handle @polymathsteve. Today's show is being sponsored by Medisend, any size medical office, facility, or hospital. Let Medisend analyze your current medical waste services and fees. You can remain with your current waste vendor, and Medisend will lower their ongoing fees to you. Medisend gets paid only if you save. Or switch your medical waste services to Medisend. They often save new clients up to 30% or more off current vendors, and fees remain level from year to year. Just go to redhothealthcare.com, fill out a few fields, and your information will only be sent to Medisend and no one else. Guys, I can't do any better than this. Medisend is good people with great intentions. Save with Medisend today. And now, we're ready for the show. The powerful reshaping occurring in the pharmaceutical industry, disruptive changes in business models, true innovation, as well as forecasting what's on the horizon for the pharma industry. And who better to do that than our guest today? Voted one of the top 10 innovators in pharma and one of the top 100 most inspiring people in healthcare in 2011, 2013, and 2015 by the industry-leading PharmaVoice. Mike Rea is the CEO of Idea Pharma, and he's worked in global pharma strategy for over 25 years. Mike has helped lead the strategic direction of over 100 pharmaceutical brands, including the top 2 launches of 2015 and over half of the 50 fastest growing drugs in the last 6 years. You can follow him on his Twitter handle @IdeaPharma, and he says you can't do great work without great clients, or in my case, great guests. Mike, it's my pleasure to welcome you aboard our flagship episode of Red Hot Healthcare.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's get right into it. Mike, I know that you've worked in global pharma strategy for over a quarter century, and I'd like to take where we're at in the industry today, and perhaps maybe even go back just a few years. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about some of the major changes that you're seeing in the industry as a whole?
I think it's an incredibly interesting space at the moment. I think that we haven't seen a lot of change, to be honest, in the last 10 years, other than in the range of what's possible. So I think if you look at the explosion of digital, the explosion of diagnostics, the incredible expansion of medtech and so forth, actually pharmaceuticals itself has been relatively stable in the middle of all of this, but the pressures are increasing. The environmental ecosystem pressures are changing all around us. So I think that there are companies that are more agile and more interesting, that are looking to adapt to that changing ecosystem, and that's what's going to drive change in the future. So we've got a lot of old guys that have been ready to deal with 2005. Companies that are ready for 2015 and 16 are already different than they were, and the companies that are ready for 2020, 2025 are beginning to find their traction right now.
Let's get into pay for performance. One of the things that is happening now more than ever is we're looking at costs being pushed down more and more. We've got costs that need to be pushed down on the hospital and health system side. But pharma is right there as well. And I know that there's going to be more demand to start looking at the value in the medications that are coming out, not only by payers, but also by health systems. Could you speak a bit on what's happening with pay for performance? Because this is a new change in the drug industry.
It absolutely is a change, and I think we're going through what I would describe as an experimental phase. I think that there's been a lot of discussion about it, and certainly in Europe, where I'm from, there's been a lot more actual practice. But beyond a couple of nods to payment for performance in the pharmaceutical sector, we haven't really seen that hit. And then you've got to look at why. Is it that all of our payers are looking for our medicines to be cheaper? Well, clearly not. There's a complicated system of people who profit from our product all of the way through the US healthcare system. But then you say, well, is the drive towards our medicines becoming lower cost? Absolutely. And I think that's going to be a global phenomenon that we need to be ready for. In terms of how pervasive have the changes been so far, I think that the warning shots are there. I think that, had Hillary Clinton won last week, even more likely to have hit us more quickly. But we cannot ignore that it's there now and that we need to be ready for that. So then we come on to the question of what do we mean by value? And clearly this is an area where we've been relatively shielded from the way that we've done business for a while, in that we've been putting drugs into people. They haven't always worked, but we've always been paid. We haven't really had to prove the value of our medicines in an economic sense until maybe Europe started having a much closer look at the affordability question. Can we continue to afford forever better medicines? So it's an interesting pressure. You look at it, it's a time when, for example, we launch a cure for hepatitis C, but the company that launches it is still criticized for the price of that medicine. We should be finding a way to have everyone celebrate that we've just launched a cure and find a way to mitigate those challenges of price to the system.
Yeah, one of the big pushes here in the U.S., and I'm sure in Europe too, is population health management. And really not only taking the existing patients we have now with their chronic conditions and better managing them, but also pulling new people out of the community that aren't engaging right now in our healthcare system, that aren't taking the medications or even they haven't even seen their doctor.
Mm-hmm.
I think we talked about this, just off air a bit about where volume is going to make a big difference to the pharma companies. Do you see population health management and reaching larger volume as the key to driving down consumer pricing?
It's clearly something that we've got to try harder at. I think that your allusion is to the price versus volume relationship, and so far I'd characterize most pharmaceutical approaches as to pricing strategy as finding a way to achieve the highest possible price for our medicine, even if that excludes some people that won't be able to get it. As soon as you adopt a consumer approach to that whole equation, it changes. So we can be seeing revenues coming back from volume that we're not getting from individuals paying a very high price. That might change the kinds of medicine that we develop, though, because you don't always have the benefits of scale when you move into, say, biologics. So it's part of that complex ecosystem. But what I do for a living is to look at 5, 10, 15 years' time on that market horizon, and then design that landscape back into the development programs. And clearly it's even more important now to design that value landscape into the programs of medicines that will hit market. So it clearly is important, and we need to think about all of those different models of ways to find some assistance for people that will want to pay for our medicines in the future.
Yes, and you're an innovation guy. I'd like to fancy myself a bit of an innovator as well. I wrote an article not too long ago on the health and hospital side to start looking at driving down costs by replacing human-based jobs with artificial intelligence. And that's not to necessarily say that we go in and have the robots running everything, and it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe personally that in time, in order to maintain profitability in these companies, many of which, of course, are publicly owned, both on the drug side and really on the provider side here in the U.S., that the cost of human capital, it's obviously the biggest cost for most any company. And I think with AI coming out now, maybe first augmenting human jobs, but eventually making things more efficient, more safe, more scalable. You don't have people that are sick. You don't have health insurance. You don't have wage disputes. And do you see any of that in the drug development end coming down the pipe in the next maybe 5 or 10 years, looking at actually replacing human jobs and human capital almost as a necessity for higher quality and driving down cost?
I agree with you wholly on the steady march of augmented and artificial intelligence into many aspects of the system. I think where you have roles that scale, you don't need to have humans making individual decisions when you can have a platform that can do the same thing. Then you come into the drug development space, and I actually have a strong belief that we already have too many people working in drug development. The move to scale in many of the large pharma companies, I think, has been to the detriment of quality. So then you say, well, is it essentially a human endeavor, or is it an algorithmic endeavor? And my preference is for the human side of experience and expertise to be brought to bear to the equation. The next thing is, are there places that intelligence could apply? And clearly there are system-wide efficiencies that we could look at for many more of those routine exercises. So I think it will have two effects. I think one is it will increase the need for skilled humans, and it might decrease the need for some of those roles that are all about the scale that we've seen so far. So I think it would be wrong to ignore that in 5-10 years' time, many of the more rote jobs in our space will not be there anymore, and for good reason. And then you look at the kind of healthcare environment and the use of our medicines. Clearly, there are people still taking individual decisions next to individual patients, which we will find odd in 5 or 10 years' time, because system-wide lessons that we can gain from, even if you took, say, atorvastatin and pravastatin, the hypothesis is those two drugs are not the same, but they're probably used interchangeably in many cases. We're not creating a feedback loop where we learn whether one is better than the other and in whom it's better. That's obviously a place where even a basic artificial intelligence application could pay dividends.
Yes, this is a excellent segue. You talk about feedback loops, and when we talk about innovation in the pharmaceutical industry, there was a paper that I read recently, I believe it's from PwC, for the pharmaceutical value chain to overlap and work within the provider value chain as well as the payer value chain, so that all along the way, pharmaceutical companies can get a better idea, especially with the big changes coming, where it should be focusing on its innovation. Maybe you can speak a little bit to that as well, because I found that very interesting that there is now a need for the pharmaceutical industry more than ever to reach out and more heavily coordinate with payer and with provider value chains.
That's an overwhelmingly salient point. The market that we launch our medicines into is not just one of physician and patient preference. There are economic buyers, there are institutional buyers who have a very reasonable need and unmet need next to some of the things that we're developing. And we've seen in recent years products like, say, Provenge, that were incredibly interesting drugs fail for market reasons. So supply chain reasons, value chain reasons, actually putting in point of care based reasons. And we've seen drugs like Opdivo that I worked on succeed because of the understanding of the chain from patient to physician to prescription to payment and the diagnostic loop that goes in there. So, I mean, these are the realities of our market. We could either choose to ignore them or we could choose to work with them and accept that not all unmet needs are biological. Some of them are system. We look at the US healthcare system, for example, and re-entry to hospitals dinging the hospital system if that is within 30 days. And, that's a reality of the US healthcare system today. So if you focus on 6-month endpoints and you ignore the 30-day endpoint within a study, you've already started to ignore one of the basic unmet needs of the system. I think that word that you use there is wholly appropriate. The value-based chain that we're talking to, it's not fixed only on the scientific clinical value of the drug. There are a whole lot of parts of the chain that we need to be thinking about in designing better medicines.
And now, a few words from your host. We'll be back to the show in less than a minute. I get email from listeners that want to know what I do. Hey, I'm a consultant that works in 3 areas: patient engagement, influencing healthcare consumers, and persuasive communication. Don't think for a second that just because you created or used some whiz-bang technology to lower chronic disease rates or capture patient-generated health data, that patients are going to raise their hands, open their eyes, line up, and get with your program. If you're treating patient engagement as a head-nodding, getting them to agree tactic, don't be surprised when they close you off. I was a provider for nearly 10,000 patients. I saw as many as 50 encounters a day, many of them self-pay and properly engaged on long-term care management. I also served in strategy and customer communications for a tech company serving millions of needy customers across the country. I know what it takes to reach patients, consumers, and the people that support them. I'm happy to chat. I'll let you know if and how I can help. Just email me, steveambroseucla@gmail.com. And now, we're ready for the show. Tell me a little bit about Idea Pharma, if you could, Mike, and a bit about the value that your organization has provided and continues to provide to so many of the top name clients, and maybe where you see Idea Pharma as perhaps a differentiator.
Yeah, so we call ourselves a path to market design group, and that essentially means taking a look at where any asset, let's say it's at the end of phase 1, where any asset could go to market. And clearly there are faster, slower, easier, harder, higher risk, higher payoff paths that could be taken. The key thing that we do as a design group is really to look at each of those paths and each of the eventual destinations, and then apply design thinking to, once you've reached that destination, how do you design that back into the program? So we see ourselves very much as a partner to our clients in helping them consider alternative ways to launch any asset, using the phase 2 and the phase 3 programs to hit whichever goal it is that we've decided to hit. So we don't have a belief that we are smarter than anyone else or that we're automatically better at finding the destination. But the core concept, the core idea, if you like, of Idea is to hold in mind possibilities of any drug launching in 5 or 10 different ways, and then trying to consider which of those 10 ways might be the best way to develop and launch a medicine.
Yes, and when you're choosing a strategy, how is this a data-driven strategy? In other words, what sort of data do you look at in order to decide perhaps which might be the best way to go?
So I think the interesting thing is this belief in certainty versus uncertainty. So much of what we're looking at is inherently unpredictable, but it's not wholly unknowable. So the idea is to look at destinations for what is known, what is unknown, and what is knowable. So, and then within that, to look at the probabilities of technical, regulatory, and commercial success within each of those paths. And the goal here is to be roughly right. We don't have to be, buried it all the way down to the depths of the data and come up with 5 decimal places, knowing that it might be off by an order of magnitude. The idea is to characterize as much of the risk and opportunity on each of those paths as possible. And then you come back to the questions that you're asking earlier about the kind of macro scale changes, price to value to payment for performance. Those macro things have to be designed back into each of those programs so that we can choose which of the 5 paths you want to pursue, but also to use phase 2 for what it's good at, which is to properly explore the value of the drug. One of the biggest mistakes we've seen in pharma innovation has been the steady pursuit of the wrong strategy at phase 2 and phase 3, killing too many drugs because they were asked to do the wrong thing in the phase 2 and phase 3 program. So one thing I'm personally a big proponent of is using phase 2 for what it's good at, which is testing the kind of innate value of the drug, and then using phase 3 to prove that value rather than to find out if the drug has value at the most expensive point in development.
Now, you think the drug companies fall into a bit of confirmation bias and they sort of pass over phase 2 when they could be using that for greater analysis and value?
Yeah, and you can hear that if they use the word, we've got a signal in phase 2, I think typically what they mean is they got enough of a hint that the drug probably does what it needs to go into phase 3. But the issue with that is if you wish that your drug is let's say it's a rheumatoid arthritis drug, or you wished that it was an Alzheimer's disease drug, what you'll probably do at that point is design a phase 2, which is a mini phase 3, which is intended to give you a little bit more confidence that you can go into the big study. But what if your drug wasn't an Alzheimer's disease drug, but let's say it was a dementia drug? Or what if your drug wasn't a rheumatoid arthritis drug, but it was an anti-inflammatory that would actually be better in ankylosing spondylitis? The idea that you would find that out of phase 2 is lost to the process because people start designing their rheumatoid arthritis studies with only rheumatoid arthritis endpoints in phase 2. So you don't know what you don't know at that point. And all you can do then is go forward within a rheumatoid arthritis guardrail or an Alzheimer's guardrail, as Lilly's done recently. What you won't know, even when you get into phase 3, then is if you fail, why you failed, or what else you could have done with that drug. So I think it's confirmation bias, but also it's a little bit of ambition bias that we're not spending enough time finding out the kind of innate talents of the drug in order to then pursue that path in phase 3 towards, maybe clearer, more niched market success.
I have a thought here as well, and I want to shift gears into consumers for a second. And that is that I read a report earlier this year put out by, I believe it was the Wharton School as well as Google. It was a paper called Pharma 3D and talked about the changing models of marketing with drug companies and how traditionally they haven't focused on the end user except more to talk at the end user from advertising. How do you see pharma companies connecting with and perhaps getting more value from their actual end users in more of a direct relationship?
So I think it's great that you raised the consumer model. If you take Apple, we all know the Genius Bar. It's a recent invention, but it's a phenomenally pervasive one. The Genius Bar isn't there just to make us feel good about Apple. It's actually part of a feedback loop for product. So, they get an early read on how and where people are using the product, where the problems are, where the gaps are, and all of that gets designed back into the next iteration of their products. That doesn't happen in pharma. We're not really listening to user feedback. We don't even really use the sales reps to listen. We use them mostly to tell. So if you think about it, we're mostly a one-way industry. So we mostly develop a drug that we think is in everyone's best interest. We tell them that it's in their best interest, and then we stop listening. If you just think about the opportunity to do any of what we experience in our outside lives and feed back to that organization about, maybe we find it easier to take half a pill rather than a full pill, and we take it twice a day. Who wants to listen to that feedback? I know a lot of patients do, and I know a lot of physicians would like to have that feedback. And I think that has to change. That's our experience in all of our lives until we get to our pharmaceutical space, and then we behave as if that one study that we did once was enough to tell you about the regimen, the formulation, the way to use the drug over time. And that has to change because it can change. There is a lot of ways of listening now that we didn't have even 10 years ago.
This has been a fantastic time. Mike, again, I have to thank you for making the time to come on to Red Hot Healthcare. Clearly, there's so much change going on in Big Pharma, and it seems that you are one of the, not only the thought leaders, but you certainly are one of the innovation mavericks helping to make that happen. So I want to thank you again, Mike, for coming on.
No, I appreciate that, Steve. And I think the industry needs antagonism and constructive approaches. So thanks for the invite.
Mike Rea from Idea Pharmaceuticals. You can reach Mike on Twitter at Idea Pharma or on the web at ideapharma.com.
You've been listening to Red Hot Healthcare with Steve Ambrose. Subscribe to us on most major podcast directories. For media or business inquiries, reach out to media@redhothealthcare.com. Thanks for listening. This is Denny Colonna. We're out of here.